Welcome to episode 2 of the tutorial walkthrough for Fortune and Glory, the cliffhanger game. In this episode, we'll mainly focus on fighting the enemies, but we'll also cover some special danger cards you might encounter and the deadly dangers. Alright, to get started, get out the main game board and then place your heroes with their figures out on the board. Just like the previous episode, you'll get out the location cards, artifact cards, and adventure cards, but we'll add new cards, the enemy card and the Nazi enemies cards. Now we haven't covered villains yet, so in the enemies cards there's several cards that refer to villains. You can either skip them or remove them from the enemy's deck. Similarly, there are 3 cards that refer to villains in the Nazi enemy deck, and so you can either skip those or remove them. For the danger deck, we won't use all the cards. Instead, we'll just pull out the ones that have the word fight on the front of the danger card. There's also only a few cards that don't have the basic skill tests on the front, so you can pull those out if you'd like. We'll talk about them in the walkthrough. And finally, you can also pull out the ones that have the red X's. Those are called deadly dangers, and we'll talk about that. Now shuffle those together and create your draw deck for the dangers. And finally, get out your skull tokens, dice, success and danger tokens, wound tokens, glory tokens, and your Nazi soldier figure and mob figures. Of course, you'd need more copies of those. This is just to show you which kinds that you need. Also, get out the competitive game round summary card. Before we talk about fighting, let's talk about the few danger cards that don't have the standard skill tests. There's only a handful of those cards, and in most cases you just need to read the text and do what it says. The cards with red X's represent deadly tests, and they were introduced in the Rise of the Crimson Hand expansion. In a deadly test, you must complete all successes in a single roll. However, if you don't succeed, you can double exert, and that means that you take 2 wounds to roll an extra die. And you can do that as long as you have extra wounds that you can take. Of course, you don't have to play with those cards if you think it makes the game too difficult. However, if you'd like, you can shuffle the special cards into the stack of danger cards for fighting for this episode. So now let's talk about dangers in which you need to fight. Very commonly, you will see something that says draw an enemy's card or draw a Nazi's enemy card. For those type of enemies, there's stacks of cards. There's a stack of enemies and stack of Nazi enemies, and you would draw one of those cards. However, there are also 3 double-sided cards that are special cards about enemies: mobsters, Nazi soldiers, Crimson Assassin, and on the other side we have Order of the Crimson Hand, zombies, and dark creatures. And you would use those special cards when it tells you to in the fight sequence. So make sure you just keep those 3 cards out separately because you don't draw them out of the deck. If you finish your movement on a water space or on a land space that doesn't have an artifact, you roll a single die. And if it turns out to be a 4, 5, or 6, then you draw an event card. However, if you draw or roll a 1, you draw an enemy card and you must fight that enemy. However, no matter what enemy type you're fighting, they will have the glory that you'll receive in winning the fight, number of fight dice, the number of wounds that they take, and they may have a defense. Also, they will have an escape skill test right there. So when your hero is fighting an enemy, they will roll the number of dice that's shown on their combat skill, while the enemy will roll the number of dice that's shown by the fight dice. So that's a good reason to have both white and green dice. In this case, we're going to let Alexander, the hero, roll white dice, and we're going to let the enemies roll green dice. Now, the enemy gets to roll 4, and the hero gets to roll 3. Unless the cards direct otherwise, when you're in a fight, you hit with a 4, 5, or 6. So let's imagine that this is the die roll. The enemy hits 3 times with a 5, 5, and a 4, and Alexander hits the enemy with 1 die, the 6. However, we need to notice that both the enemy and Alexander have a defense of 1, and defense basically blocks any hit. Since 1 hit from Alexander is blocked and 1 hit from the enemies is blocked, Alexander will take 2 wounds because there were 2 final hits, and the enemies will take no hits. Fights occur in a series of rounds, so that was just the first round. Now Alexander has to decide whether he wants to fight again, because the fight only ends when either Alexander escapes or he defeats the enemy. In this case, that means that the enemy has taken 3 wounds. Of course, the other way that it can end is Alexander could take 6 wounds and be knocked out. In order to escape, you just pass the skill test that's shown for the escape. In this case, he would have to use agility to have success on a 6+ and have 1 success. This test is just a basic skill test, so it follows the same rules that we've described in the first episode. Now, if a hero tries to escape and is unsuccessful, then the enemies get to roll their fight dice, but the hero doesn't get to roll theirs. So let's imagine that the enemies roll a 6, 4, 1, and 1. Well, of course, they succeed with 2, but there's 1 defense, so Alexander takes another wound. And the fight must continue. If the hero is successful in escaping, they're considered successful in passing the danger, but they do not gain the glory shown on the card. If, on the other hand, the hero defeats the enemy, they gain the glory shown on the card immediately and are considered successful in passing the danger. They will gain the glory with this card even if the hero is knocked out in the same round that the enemy is defeated. In some cases, when you draw a card, there might be some limitations, such as in this stowaway on a Zeppelin, it says, if it is not the keyword infantry, redraw. So in that case, if you drew the Nazi enemy Panzer tank, notice it doesn't have the keyword that's in the middle here of infantry. However, Nazi patrol does have infantry, so you would redraw and stop when you get to one that has an infantry keyword. Now, one interesting card is this Nazi gold. It doesn't have the keyword infantry on it in the Zeppelin case, but you don't redraw it. Because this is a modifier card, notice it is just increasing the number of fight dice because it's an escorted gold. But it's not an enemy in itself, so you don't redraw this one. And if you're drawing an enemy, you keep drawing until you finally do get an enemy. So you could have multiple gold cards in one attack. So in this particular example, you would actually be fighting a Nazi patrol and escorting 2 golds. So he actually has 3 fight dice, +2, +2, so a total of 7 fight dice. Now you're ready to start the adventure for this episode. You'll gain 2 artifacts by just using the danger cards that have the fight type. Get out an artifact and adventure card for each hero and place them in a location like we did in the first episode. Don't forget that if your hero ends their movement on a land or water space where you're not discovering an artifact, then you need to roll a dice to see whether or not you get an event card or you fight an enemy. We're going to ignore the 4, 5, and 6 where you get an event card, but if you roll a 1, you need to fight an enemy. So draw the enemy card. If your hero gets knocked out, just return them to their home city, and the first hero that gains 2 artifacts wins. If you're playing solo, just try to gain 2 artifacts. So that's it for this episode. Give it a try yourself, and join me again on the next episode of Fortune and Glory, the cliffhanger game.